afternoon. So, for these first human rights conversations organized as part of the activities of the UCD Center for Human Rights, I have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Siobhan Airey. We'll talk about Spectres of Sacrifice in Solidarity with the intriguing subtitle of Resisting Hallmarkisation of Heaney and Human Rights. So first, I'd like to briefly introduce you, Siobhan. You are a Marie-Luce Paris postdoctoral and Irish Research Council Fellow. You research on the intersection of law, governance, and international development, and development aid in particular. You're completing research on the international governance and blending finance for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So today, Siobhan, you will be talking about a topic which resonates with a lot of other presentations and talks that have been given on human rights, especially on the notion of solidarity. I'm thinking in particular of the UCD Geary Institute for Public Policy, which issued a video presentation last April on human rights. It was chaired by Professor Sinead Gibney. In which the issue of solidarity towards the most vulnerable members of the Irish society was prominent. Present your thoughts, because you insist more on the notion of sacrifice, which is linked to the notion of solidarity. And you will combine human rights issues and a reference to a great classical text and poet. It really reflects on the essence of what's important in our efforts to bring about changing to society, as we progressively are trying to get out of these difficult pandemic times. So first, could you explain to us why you have chosen this topic, and in particular your choice to refer to the famous Irish poet and his very well-known quote? Thank you.
Thank you so much, firstly, for the very generous invitation to have me there, and indeed the introduction, and thank you for just placing these thoughts in context. I think, when the pandemic happened, I think a lot of us who do research in the area of law and human rights started thinking, how is my research going to speak to this? You know what I mean? This new change times, because we know this is not just a short-term thing. You know what I mean? It's going to have long-term ramifications. And in a funny way, I guess this has nothing to do with my previous research, kind of at my current research on development aid. This is to do with literally law and poetry and solidarity and action, and how do we engage differently and think differently about problems that have already been pre-existing and have been exacerbated as a result of the pandemic. And so what prompted me to think this way was the quotation, if we winter this one out, we can summer anywhere. And this is a quotation by as you mentioned there, one of our famous national poets, Seamus Heaney. And this quote seemed to take off and take on a life of its own in a variety of public media, including social media, at the start of the official responses to the COVID-19 pandemic in Ireland. And if you remember, there was a weekend in the middle of March here in Ireland anyway, that the schools and the creches and the universities closed. And it was then around that time that I first noticed this quotation coming up on Twitter. And it was very frequently linked to many of the hashtags that express solidarity and support for frontline workers that emerged at that time. And then the following month, on April the 10th, it was included in our Prime Minister, our Taoiseach Leo Varadkar's speech to the nation, the one that won him widespread recognition internationally and was, circulated kind of around the world. But this wintering quote was even tweeted by the Irish National Library. It's like our Irish National Institution of Record. You know what I mean there? Mm. And it was retweeted on April the 13th, and then later on it was even retweeted by the Irish mission to the UN. So I kind of was curious as to how come this quotation from Heaney was helping kind of, we'll say, official Ireland to frame its response to the COVID-19 pandemic, but in a very particular way. So for me, the quote took on a role like other kinds of symbolic performances, such as the timed clapping of hands for health workers and so on. And in my view, this wintering quote and the hand clapping for care workers, these are rituals that symbolically evoke a very particular idea that performances and practices of hope and solidarity and sacrifice, they will lead to a utopian post-COVID future. But in doing these rituals, they kind of turn our gaze away from the very real difficulties and suffering that people in Ireland and indeed abroad were experiencing as a result of the pandemic. And as we now clearly know, they've affected some groups and communities and some places around the world far more deeply than others. Now, in this kind of few words, I'll be focusing mainly on Ireland, but I do think there's relevance for other kind of international contexts and everything as well. So I just, it's actually fascinating, right? But I discovered that Seamus Heaney, right? He had said these words during an interview around the time of the launch of his Wintering Out collection in 1972. And in that collection, he includes a poem called Tolland Man, one of a series of poems that are known as his Bog Bodies cycle. Now here on this slide, I include pictures of Tolland Men on which that poem is based. And as you can see, it's a male body from the 4th century BC in pre-Roman Iron Age northern Denmark. And it was found in the 1950s in northern Jutland in Denmark. And this poor man was strangled to death with a leather thong as part of a sacrificial ritual. It's a bit grisly, right? But I think the poem and the story behind it has a particular relevance for how we think of the role of public rituals and symbolic performances in framing official responses to COVID-19. And the idea that behind this official response, there has been an additional and distinct form of sacrifice imposed on certain vulnerable groups of people in Ireland above and beyond that's been asked of the rest of the population. And that this additional burden and this additional difficulty builds on already pre-existing challenges and vulnerabilities that are experienced by these groups. Challenges and difficulties that are exacerbated by earlier hidden institutionalized practices by the state and by society, which in my view themselves act as forms of violence imposed on these groups. And that's where the idea of Hallmarkisation emerged, I think, really. So Hallmark, as we know, it's the well-known producer of cards like birthday cards, congratulations cards, and everything like that. And I thought in this context, the use of the Heaney Wintering Out quotation was kind of like a Hallmark maneuver, you know, like a card with an inscription saying, wishing you a good pandemic or something like that. Do you know what I mean? And I felt that Hallmarkisation as a concept is a way of capturing the kind of the disconnect between the recognition and truth and insight that Heaney brings to his take on Irish life through his poetry and the kind of sanitized, selective approach to COVID-19 that Official Ireland's use of the Heaney Wintering Out quotation conveys. And so, sorry, Marie-Luce.
Yeah, talk about sacrifice. What about this idea of sacrifice too, which you use in your title and, with solidarity? To what extent do you think there is a sacrifice in the context of the pandemic, and for who?
Now, we know that from archaeologists that throughout human history, human sacrifice has helped to create and maintain a stratified society. And we know that the practice of human sacrifice was often used by social elites as a display of power designed to instill reluctance and fear of transgressing the ruling authority. Now, we know from anthropologists that human sacrifice is a very effective way of building and maintaining social control because it creates a public spectacle in which the broader community, that is like all of us, become personally involved and we become complicit. So the public and communal aspect of the sacrifice minimizes the potential of retaliation because we are all now in collusion with and in agreement with the decision making of that ruling authority and that power structure. And of course, another thing that both archaeologists and anthropologists have told us is that in the past, victims of human sacrifice were typically low status, such as slaves or captives, and thus they were the others, and they're not part of our society, us and our group. And so it might seem a bit of a stretch to link the idea of sacrifice in history to the official response of COVID-19 now, but in my view, a link does exist. So from very early on, after the measures, to respond to and to deal with the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic in Ireland existed, Like, we learned quite early on from the media and other official reports that the effects of, for example, like the lockdown, the stay at home, the shutting of workplaces and education institutions, they were, and I mean this like quite literally, experienced as quite brutal by certain groups of people in Ireland. And for example, the stay-at-home mandate immediately put women and families at much higher risk of experiencing domestic violence and coercive control. Now, unfortunately, this risk became realised as very real physical and psychological harm that required official intervention. And we know this from the initial evidence reported by women's domestic violence services, such as Women's Aid, and indeed from figures provided by the Gardaí. So, like, the home is not a safe place for survivors of domestic violence. And in the stay-at-home official response, this has clearly resulted in additional harm to some women and families. And actually, that's a very interesting, the idea of the public-private link, you know what I mean there, because this actually comes up particularly also in relation to the next group I'm looking at. I'm just looking at two now, which is, these are the people that are in what we call direct provision in Ireland, right? Now, direct provision is where the state in Ireland provides accommodation, food and essential services to people that have applied for asylum or to be a refugee in Ireland. Now, there are 35 of those residential centres around the country, only 3 of which are purpose-built, and many are former hotels and guest houses or religious buildings such as convents. And this is where the public-private dimension is a very interesting one, because these centres are privately run. The state contracts out their running to private for-profit corporations. And, you know, like we know, like, I don't know for you, Marie-Luce, but for me, certainly how important eating and food was to me during this pandemic, you know, like, be able to make our own food, be able to eat the food we want and everything. Now, most direct provision centres tend to provide 3 set meals a day at set times, and residents may not cook their own food unless communal cooking facilities are provided at the centre. Now, what's interesting in the Irish scenario is the direct provision centre system, was introduced in 2000, and from quite early on, it has been condemned, right? In 2015, an independent working group reported to the government with over 170 recommendations for reform. That was called the McMahon Report. And as recently as a few months ago, last December, the Oireachtas Committee on Justice and Equality Reform produced another report, and it recommended, and I'm quoting here, root and branch reform and preferably replacement, right? So there are now about 7,000 people living in these centres. And in actual fact, I just did a quick comparison to see how does that relate to our prison population? And our prison population is over 3,000, I think it's about 3,900. So we nearly have double the amount of people living in these direct provision centres that we have actually in prison in Ireland. And we know from the media reports on the transfer of people seeking asylum to the Skellig Hotel in Carrick-Sibeen, and here this image I have on the slide is actually from some media reports at the time in mid-March, that it was absolutely impossible for residents to adhere to the public health guidelines that were issued for all of us. And over 20 residents of that direct provision centre tested positive for the Covid-19 virus. And according to local media reports, the owner of the Skellig, the private provider of the Skellig Hotel Direct Provision Centre, runs another 3 direct provision centres. So here again, we see another group. And these now are people originally who come from outside of our state, people who don't yet have citizenship in this country, being forced to deal with the very real negative health consequences, which is already enormous personal stress and disruption. But this is on top of, you know, the negative effects of months and years of what I would call bureaucratic violence from the direct provision system. And what do I mean by bureaucratic violence? Here I mean the combination of, I think, legal and political authority, of the state bureaucracy and private corporate activity. And this is imposed on people who are actually seeking international protection in Ireland. And these people don't have alternative options. Now, I suppose one of the things I noticed, you know, there, and we would all, I suppose, be aware of, is like that very often it's quite frequent that human rights are kind of rhetorically deployed in instances like these in relation to, say, women experiencing domestic violence, in relation to families, you know, in the direct provision system. to either immediately address the problem or else to guide policy responses, towards more equitable outcomes. And indeed, we have seen this, in the last few months.
To pursue the discussion in terms of precedents, what role, and it's a more general question, I suppose, what role has been articulated for human rights in responding to the crisis?
This is actually quite interesting. There are other examples, you know what I mean? Like I lived quite a while in Canada, and the Canadian example of dealing with reception and integration was a model that really engaged with communities, you know what I mean, there as well, and worked very much with local NGOs. There's the model in Portugal, and another one in Scotland has been proposed. I mean, one of the great things that Portugal did was it basically said that, for anybody living in Portugal, even people who just with immigrant visas, they would be entitled to the same kinds of health services as citizens of Portugal at the time of COVID. Do you know what I mean there? So it didn't set up this dual kind of, double standard kind of thing there that the direct provision system actually did set up. And in terms of obviously a human rights response, as I was saying earlier, yes, there was, several calls for kind of a human rights response. But when I went through what they were, the details of it, like to move beyond the rhetoric into what are we talking about, to me, four things kind of, stood out. One was that there should be kind of human rights impact assessments, and this is quite a technocratic exercise where the human rights impacts of a measure on a rights holder, like a person or a group, are identified and assessed. Another is that sunset clauses. These are time limits put on a particular measure so they don't become permanent. The need for like a dedicated exercise to identify data on the human rights impacts of COVID-19. And of course, parliamentary oversight was also mentioned. And of course, this is particularly important because even though we had an election in early February, we actually, indeed, as we're recording this, we still don't have a government. So that was particularly important. But in looking at the detail of these kinds of human rights approaches, to me, they represented, I suppose, I would call it a weak washing, if there's that word, of human rights. Kind of like the Hallmarkisation of Heaney I was talking about earlier. In this, I felt this was like a Hallmarkisation of human rights as well, right? These kinds of approaches. And what did I mean by this? And I guess that if you look at in more detail at those ones there, the calls for human rights impact assessments and data, we already have an enormous amount of data. Do you know what I mean? They're on women that experience domestic violence and families as well that are affected by it, and also on people and families in the direct provision centre. There are very credible and authoritative data exists and reports, including official ones. Sunset clauses, even though they're very, very useful, they don't actually take account of the additional burden that the measure has added to on that group as a result of being introduced. And while parliamentary oversight is certainly necessary, well, in Ireland, we don't have a good history of kind of timely and effective oversight of, the impacts of long-standing institutions and measures. You have to think here about things like the Magdalene laundries, the industrial schools, and, direct provision was introduced in 2000, as you mentioned, as a temporary measure. And it took 15 years before the first official review was actually done of that. Do you know what I mean there? So in my view, I suppose these would be human rights light in this particular context. And I suppose I would call them kind of the Hallmarkisation of human rights.
Then in terms of what the law can do, and especially human rights law, which is quite broad, how do you envisage the different actions that we as a society can take to tackle the aftermath of this crisis and precisely to improve the situation for the vulnerable people? So it's a very broad question, obviously, but you have, I understand, some ideas about that. So.
Yeah, and here I thought, well, let's go back to poetry again. Now, Marie-Luce, this is actually the poem Tolland Man, right, that Seamus Heaney included in that Wintering Out collection. And I would really encourage anybody there just to go back and have a look at it, right? But what I've done here in yellow, right, is I've just highlighted the pieces that relate to the poet himself, right? And he talks here about, like, I will go to Argos. I will stand a long time. I could risk blasphemy. You know what I mean? Something of his sad freedom should come to me. You know what I mean? He's deeply affected by the vision of this man. He's looking at the pointing hands of the country people, and he's acknowledging that he will feel lost, unhappy, but at home. We are now living in an era, I suppose, where secular forms of violence are evident in mainstream political and economic life. And while we might think of examples of contemporary forms of human sacrifices in acts of terrorism, like I would argue that here in contemporary Ireland, there are elements of human sacrifice to be found as a result of the bureaucratic and institutionalized violence in areas such as immigration and migration and the asylum process, in how we continue to respond to women and families that experience domestic violence and sexual assault. And bureaucratic violence, and I go back to that, it is administered through public and private systems that fail to provide access to sufficient resources for people to live a life with dignity. So for women and families experiencing domestic violence, and for the people and families in direct provision, these resources would mean like real access to effective legal counsel and an effective legal system. It would mean access to safe housing and a safe community environment. It would mean other basic rights and needs are being met, such as having enough money to live safely and to be able to cook the food that you want to eat. And to address this kind of institutionalized systemic and bureaucratic violence, I guess I would argue that we need an approach to human rights and to law that is in addition to those called for earlier, and I would say these should rely on agency and action as part of solidarity. And just going back to your question, on what we as persons and society to do, I think the examples are already there. The main thing I think is not to be a bystander, right? To be not one of the country people that Heaney writes about, someone who points their hand, but who acts in ways that enables that human sacrifice to continue unchallenged. And here, there are very simple ways not to be a bystander, and I've listed the obvious ways here. But we can also act in solidarity. And I've also listed some of the organizations that are active in the areas of direct provision and violence against women. And these organizations offer a variety of different ways for people to get involved, from donating, from writing, from getting involved more politically, from offering one-to-one support. And I think it is in these ways that we can resist the Hallmarkisation of Heaney and the Hallmarkisation of human rights. So that instead of ritualizing acceptance of sacrifice, instead could we ritualize action in solidarity with those people, one in a way that meets the immediate needs of vulnerable people and groups, but also recognizes and tackles the more invisible, institutionalized, bureaucratic violence that is imposed as part of the response to COVID-19. And I guess just in case anybody is interested in some of the information that I've drawn from this, they are some of the resources that people can follow up on anyway.
Yeah. So, okay, no, yes, it's good, very good to have the resources and to have the reference. But so thank you for the list of resources, and thank you very much for your talk, and that was a very interesting perspective, and I think a nice introduction to the series of conversations that we will have. I've a few others lined up for the next few weeks. So I've mentioned before in the previous video that interested colleagues may contact me or may contact you directly if they have questions about your research, about your work. So thank you very much, Siobhan, and I wish you a nice afternoon, and thank you for watching.
And Marie-Luce, if I can just say to acknowledge the really great work that is being done by NGOs and by people in their communities acting in solidarity. And certainly I would hope that say by putting up the list of contacts and everything there for those, it's a way of drawing attention to those. But if we're interested, I guess, in a publicly oriented state, maybe we as citizens, those of us who have citizenship, can exercise our citizenship responsibilities and encourage the state to move in that direction.
Okay, so have a nice afternoon, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Marie-Luce. Take care. Bye-bye.